Hello everyone and welcome back to this supplementary video on the pump wash system. We are going to specifically be talking about the sample pump and the way that we introduce our sample to the column. As you could see, there's just a couple of things that we've added to this entire diagram, which would be our L valve. Now, the sample pump has an inlet and outlet, and as you can see, when the fluid runs out of the outlet, it eventually reaches the L valve, where its position would determine if it could either go to waste or to our column. To sort of demonstrate what's inside of the column and how it changes throughout the entire video, I've taken away this sort of green film that it has on it in order to show its insides. Right now, for sterility's sake, the column as well as the entire pump wash system is filled with ethanol. And so the idea here is that we're going to be introducing our water to the system in order to flush out that ethanol and eventually make an ideal environment to bring in our sample. So if you're not really familiar with the entire flow path of this sample pump system, I recommend watching this first part just a couple of times to get yourself familiar and then move on to the rest of the video. But as you can see, when our pump wash begins, it starts in this position here where the piston is closed. And as it begins moving to the right, it is sucking up our fluid from our inlet. And on the other piston here, when it is fully extended, it's going to be pushing outwards. And in this case, because it is not connected to our inlet, it's going to be pushing that fluid into our outlet. And as you can see from the cell valve here, it's going to be going to our waste. So without further ado, we'll just see that in action. And as you can see, our system has pulled in the water and our ethanol has been pushed out. The central valve changes and now the entire flow path is also changed. This allows this piston down here to be connected to the water and it begins to suck up and the remaining water in this piston here gets pushed out. At the end of the solvent change, we end up having this entire line system filled with our water, and that allows us to continue into washing our column with that water. Now, because we are working with a column here, which is a very delicate instrument, we don't want to have a very fast flow rate as we do a regular solvent change. I just want you to keep that in mind as I begin this run because it is relatively fast, but that's just for the sake of this video. The idea of a slow flow rate is because we do not want to introduce a lot of pressure into our column because that would end up damaging the structure and it ends up causing a lot of issues where the column does not work as intended. But once we start our run, we're going to be pushing our water into the column, and as you can see, the ethanol has been expelled. We're just going to be continuing that water wash just a little bit more, but now it is time to introduce our buffer. Before we do that, we change our L valve back to waste, and then change our inlet to buffer, and we begin a solvent change to expel that leftover water and bring in our buffer. Okay, so once that is done, we end up changing the L valve so the buffer can be delivered directly to our column. And this is where we start the run once more, so we can push our buffer into our column, expelling that water. And just give it just a little bit more rinse. But once this step is finished, the entire system is now filled with buffer, and it is adequate to have our sample being introduced. So the idea here is that once we have our sample, we can introduce it to our column. We just do a normal run because we do not want to start another solvent change. The idea here is that the solvent change is a rather wasteful process, and we definitely don't want to let our sample flow directly to the waste. So we keep our L valve still connected to our column, and we just do another run. As you can see here, when we start, this piston ends up pushing some of our remaining buffer to the column. But when this valve changes, now it is pushing our sample to the column. So this step is called the loading process because we're loading our proteins to the column. In this step here, we end up just continuing the run until we have no more protein left to put into the system. But if you can imagine that after this step, we're still going to be having a little bit of protein left inside of the pumps. So to introduce the rest of our proteins to the column, we'll switch back our inlet to buffer. And so we can allow this piston here to push the rest of our sample. And now we can introduce a little bit of buffer to begin the washing process for our column. Well, technically, we have replaced the sample inside of the column with our buffer. It does not necessarily mean we've taken out all of the proteins. We have taken out most of the non-specific binding proteins from our column, but we will continue the purification process in order to release and then elute all of those specific binding proteins that have remained stuck to that column in order to collect and then further purify for future projects. But I would love to explain more of those steps in detail in our next lecture, and I hope to see you there come Saturday. Thank you very much.